dignity, his identity, and his father's love. You think you can just lie to me and walk out of here? Like you're somebody important, huh? The officer barked, his voice laced with venom. Don't you dare look at me like that. The boy's chest heaved as he struggled to keep his composure. I'm not lying, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear and frustration. My dad gave me that chain. It's mine, please. Shut it. The officer cut him off, throwing the chain into his pocket like it was nothing more than loose change. His eyes bore into the boy, cold and unfeeling. You people always want to play the victim. You think anyone in here is going to stand up for you? He gestured wildly toward the other customers. The boy glanced around, desperate for help. A woman near the magazine rack flinched when their eyes met, quickly turning her head. A man at the counter shuffled his feet, staring intently at the candy display as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. See that? The officer sneered, leaning in so close the boy could smell the coffee on his breath. Nobody cares about you, kid. Nobody ever will. That's enough. The voice was sharp, commanding, cutting through the tense silence like a thunderclap. Heads turned as an older man stepped forward, his presence calm but unyielding. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes blazed with quiet fury. Who the hell are you? The officer snapped, straightening up as if to reassert his dominance. Someone who's seen enough of this nonsense, the man said evenly, his tone steady but charged with authority that didn't come from a badge. Put the chain back. Now. You don't tell me what to do. The officer snarled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. I said now, the man repeated, his voice rising only slightly but with enough force to make the officer hesitate. Unless you'd like this incident to be recorded and shared with someone who does tell you what to do. The officer's hand twitched toward the chain in his pocket. His jaw tightened as he glanced around the store, realizing the customers who had avoided eye contact moments ago were now watching intently, their phones out, cameras rolling. For a long, tense moment, the officer stood frozen. Then, with a muttered curse, he yanked the chain out of his pocket and tossed it to the ground at the boy's feet. Keep it, he growled. Not worth my time. The boy bent down to pick it up, his hands trembling as he clutched the chain to his chest. He looked up at the older man, who gave him a small nod of reassurance before turning back to the officer. You should leave, the man said quietly, but there was no mistaking it for a suggestion. The officer glared at him, his face dark with anger and humiliation, but he didn't say another word. With one last glare at the boy, he turned and stormed out of the store, the bell above the door jangling harshly in his wake. The boy stood there, clutching the chain tightly, the heat of the humiliation still burning in his chest. But as the older man placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, he felt something else begin to rise, a small, flickering ember of hope. You okay, son? The man asked gently. The boy nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Thank you, he whispered. The man smiled faintly. You hold on to that chain, you hear me? Don't let anyone take it or your pride away from you again. For the first time that evening, the boy felt the corners of his mouth lift into a small, shaky smile. And as he walked out of the store, the chain secure around his neck, he promised himself that no one, no matter how powerful they seemed, would ever take away what truly mattered to him again. As the boy stepped out into the cool night air, he glanced back over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of the older man through the store window. The man gave him a subtle nod of encouragement before turning back to his shopping, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The boy clutched the chain tightly in his hand, his fingers tracing the delicate grooves in the gold. His heart still pounded, the adrenaline of the encounter refusing to leave his veins. The streets were quiet, the flickering streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. He felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief that the ordeal was over, but unease at the thought of what could have happened if the older man hadn't stepped in. He walked slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't go home yet, not like this. His father had always told him to stand tall, no matter what the world threw at him, but tonight he felt smaller than ever. He crossed the street and headed toward the park, where the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of passing cars offered a kind of solace. Sitting down on a worn bench near the playground, he stared at the chain in his hands. The gold glimmered faintly under the pale moonlight. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a connection to his father, to his family's history, to everything he was proud of. But tonight, it had almost been taken from him. He replayed the officer's words in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Someone like you. The phrase echoed like a taunt, feeding a fire of anger and hurt that he didn't quite know how to handle. Hey! A voice broke through his thoughts, startling him. He looked up to see a girl around his age standing a few feet away. Her dark curls framed her face, and her hands were shoved into the pockets of a faded hoodie. She looked at him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You okay?" she asked, taking a cautious step closer. The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You don't look fine," she said bluntly, sitting down on the other end of the bench. "I saw what happened back at the store." His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You were there?" She nodded, her expression serious. "I was behind the soda display. I wanted to say something, but you didn't," he finished for her, his voice sharper than he intended. She flinched but didn't look away. "No, I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. He stared at her for a moment, then looked back down at the chain in his hands. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "Nobody ever does." "That's not true," she said firmly. "That man who stood up for you, he did. And so would I, next time." "Next time?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "There shouldn't be a next time." "I know," she said softly, "but we both know there probably will be." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy blanket. "What's your name?" she asked eventually. "Jay," he replied, his voice quieter now. "I'm Mia," she said, offering a small smile. "Nice to meet you, Jay." He glanced at her, then back at the chain. "Yeah, you too, I guess." Mia leaned back on the bench, staring up at the stars peeking through the tree branches. "You know," she said after a moment, "people like that cop, they want you to feel small. They want you to think you don't matter. But you do. You've got to remember that." Jay didn't respond right away. He was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling inside him. But her words stuck with him, as if they'd planted a tiny seed in the middle of the chaos. For the first time since he left the store, the anger in his chest began to shift, making room for something else, something quieter, but just as powerful: hope. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for now, sitting on that bench with a stranger who seemed to understand, he felt just a little less alone. As the night deepened, the park began to stir with life in its quiet corners. Jay and Mia sat silently, their conversation fading into the hum of the world around them. A dog barked in the distance, and the faint sound of music drifted through the air from somewhere nearby. Jay, still holding the chain tightly in his hand, leaned back against the bench, his body slowly relaxing. "You come here often?" Mia asked, breaking the silence. Jay shook his head. "Not really, just needed to clear my head." Before Mia could respond, a voice called out from the shadows, startling them both. "Yo, Mia, that you?" They turned to see a tall, lanky figure emerging from behind a cluster of trees. He wore a leather jacket to sizes too big and had a beanie pulled low over his curly hair. His grin was wide and mischievous, but his eyes darted around like he was always looking for trouble. "Who's this?" the boy asked, nodding toward Jay as he shoved his hands into his pockets. "None of your business, Ray," Mia said, rolling her eyes. "Why are you sneaking around?" "I wasn't sneaking," Ray shot back, feigning offense. "I was just patrolling, making sure everything's cool, you know." "Right," Mia said, unimpressed. "Well, we're fine, so you can go back to whatever it is you were doing." Ray ignored her and turned his attention to Jay, his grin widening. "You new around here, man? Never seen you before." Jay hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially with someone who looked like they thrived on stirring up chaos. "He's just passing through," Mia said quickly, shooting Ray a warning look. "Passing through, huh?" Ray said, clearly not buying it. He leaned in closer, studying Jay with exaggerated curiosity. "What's that you got there?" Jay instinctively clutched the chain tighter, his jaw tightening. "Nothing," he said, his voice low. Ray raised an eyebrow, a playful but dangerous edge creeping into his tone. "Doesn't look like nothing." "Don't even think about it, Ray," Mia said sharply, stepping between the two boys. "Leave him alone." Ray held up his hands, his grin never wavering. "Relax, I'm just messing around. No harm, no foul." As he backed off, another figure appeared. This one a girl with a skateboard tucked under her arm. She had short, choppy hair dyed electric blue and a streak of paint smeared across her cheek. as if she'd just come from an art project. "Ray, stop being a jerk," she said, smacking him on the arm as she approached. "Ow, Tasha," Ray complained, rubbing his arm. "What's with everyone ganging up on me tonight?" "Because you're you," Tasha said dryly, then turned to Mia and Jay. "Sorry about him. He's like a stray dog, annoying, but mostly harmless." Mia smirked. "Mostly." Jay stayed quiet, still trying to gauge whether these new people were a threat or not. "I'm Tasha, by the way," the girl said, offering Jay a smile. "Don't mind Ray. He talks a lot, but he's all bark, no bite." "I bite sometimes," Ray muttered under his breath, earning another smack from Tasha. Jay finally relaxed enough to speak. "I'm Jay," he said cautiously. "Nice to meet you, Jay," Tasha said. "You from around here?" Jay hesitated again, unsure how much he wanted to share. "Not really, just needed some air." "Well, you picked the right spot," Tasha said, gesturing around the park. "This is where all the misfits hang out. You'll fit right in." "I don't know about that," Jay said, managing a faint smile. Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the path behind them. A new figure emerged, this one older and more imposing. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, and his eyes scanned the group with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "You kids causing trouble?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Everyone froze, the tension palpable. Ray was the first to recover, flashing his trademark grin. "Trouble? Us? Never, man," he said, spreading his arms in mock innocence. The man's gaze lingered on Jay for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You all right, kid?" Jay nodded, though his grip on the chain tightened again. "Yeah, I'm fine." The man studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good, keep it that way." With that, he turned and walked off, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. "Who was that?" Jay asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No idea," Mia said, frowning, "but he's been hanging around the park a lot lately. Kind of creepy, honestly." "Creepy but harmless," Ray said with a shrug. "Probably just some loner with nothing better to do." Jay wasn't so sure. There was something about the man's presence that unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. As the group fell into an uneasy silence, the night stretched on, bringing with it the promise of more questions and possibly more trouble. The uneasy silence between them lingered for a moment longer, before Mia sighed and stood up, brushing off her hoodie. "It's late. We should probably head home." Jay nodded, glancing back in the direction where the mysterious man had disappeared. Something about him still gnawed at the edges of his mind, but he decided to let it go. After everything that had happened tonight, he didn't have the energy to dwell on another potential problem. "Yeah," he muttered. "I should go too." "I'll walk you," Mia said. Jay hesitated. "You don't have to." "It's fine," she interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Ray and Tasha, you two stay out of trouble." Ray smirked, giving them a mock salute. "No promises." As Jay and Mia walked toward the park exit, the night air grew colder, but the tension from earlier began to ease. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, their soft glow illuminating the quiet streets. "You okay?" Mia asked after a while, breaking the silence. Jay nodded. "Yeah, thanks for, sticking around." Mia smiled faintly. Someone had to. That cop back there, he was wrong. And people like him, they want you to feel small, to give up. But you didn't. That matters. Jay didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the chain in his hand, its gold glinting faintly in the light. The anger and shame that had burned so fiercely earlier now felt distant, replaced by a quiet resolve. When they reached Jay's street, he turned to Mia. "This is me," he said. She nodded. "All right, get some rest, okay?" "I will," Jay said. He hesitated, then added, "Thanks again." "Anytime," Mia said with a small wave before turning and heading back toward the park. Jay watched her go for a moment, then slipped the chain back around his neck. He walked up the steps to his apartment and let himself in quietly, careful not to wake his mom. In his room, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared out the window at the city lights. He thought about the officer, the older man who had stood up for him, the strangers at the park, and Mia. Everyone he had encountered tonight had left an imprint on him, some for better, some for worse. But what mattered most was the chain now resting against his chest. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of his father's love, his family's pride, and his own strength. He made a silent promise to himself as he lay down to sleep. No matter what the world threw at him, he would hold on to his dignity, his pride, and the things that truly mattered. The lesson: the story teaches us that standing up for ourselves and others in the face of injustice is never easy, but it's necessary. The people who try to strip us of our identity, our dignity, and our worth only succeed if we let them. Surrounding ourselves with those who uplift us and remembering our inner strength can help us rise above even the darkest moments. It also reminds us of the power of kindness and courage. Whether it's the older man standing up to authority, Mia offering support, or even Jay's determination not to let himself be broken. Sometimes, it's the small acts of resistance and solidarity that make the biggest difference.